Welcome, Bridge Builders, to another episode of the podcast. Again, we've got Ashton and Juliet here with me, your co-hosts, all three of us co-hosts, for the podcast going forward. And we're excited for today's episode. We're actually recording two today, so if you see us in the same outfits, it's not because we went home and wore the same thing, but anyway, so cool. Today, we're going to be talking about a little bit about priesthood, authority, maybe a little bit about the new apostle that was called Clark Gilbert, and we'll kind of go from there. So thanks, guys, for being here. Remember to like and subscribe, really quick. And if you can financially support the podcast, there are links in the description to check that out. So thank you. All right.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it. So the news, was it this week or last week that he was called?
I think, let's see, this is Thursday. I think it was last week.
Okay.
Yeah, last week that he was called.
So hot off the press.
Yeah.
We have a new apostle in town.
Yep.
The only thing I knew about him going from this was that he, like, some stuff, I guess, in the background of, like, what was going on at BYU, basically. Besides that, I had not heard of him before. I don't think I'd even seen his face when I had heard that stuff before, so
Yeah.
he was a new face to me. I'm not sure about you guys.
I think I probably was mostly the same. Like, I think I kind of knew of him as a little bit of, like, an amorphous figure or force, you know? I also didn't recognize his face. But do you want to share, like, what you had heard from BYU?
So essentially, from what I've heard, he was in some administrative role. I don't know exactly what it was, if you guys are aware.
He was the church education commissioner,
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was the title of it.
Big, powerful.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
And I know that there was kind of a bit of a crackdown with at least faculty and staff at BYU that he kind of, I heard he made kind of like 4 categories basically of these faculty members. And there was like I forget, they have different titles, but essentially they fall into like very devout, follow the prophet, follow the teachings of the church, like pretty much devout, like follow the teachings of the church, maybe a little bit looser on some things or interpretations. And then there's like more critical, and then there's like very critical kind of thing. And so with that, I think some professors were let go, fired. There was like a reaffirmation kind of thing that a lot of professors had to do where they had to kind of take a pledge. Mm-hmm. I think new staff were supposed to take this pledge for sure, and then old staff were highly recommended to kind of take this pledge. And then I think it was more than just an ecclesiastical endorsement. Like they actually had to have an active temple recommend to continue teaching. And so a little bit more kind of like laying down the law kind of thing.
Yeah. He, when President Holland gave his musket fire speech, he introduced Clark Gilbert in his role at that time.
Okay.
And so some people have kind of interpreted that to mean that Elder Holland, who Elder Clark has ended up replacing because he just passed away, was kind of introducing Clark Gilbert as the enforcer, maybe, of like the musket fire disposition of, I guess, I don't know, cracking down on being gay, or we'll say family values.
Family.
Yeah, family values and sort of the traditional historical positions of the church when it comes to those things. And yeah, what I knew in the news from him was that there was some tension that was being caused, I'll say, by him. I think some people wouldn't see it as tension being caused by him. I think, some people would frame that differently. It was interesting, though, when I asked the Instagram followers, like, what if people knew about him, it seemed like most people who were active in the church had never heard of him. Mm-hmm. But people who were not active, like, were more likely to have heard of him. And so I think it's, and in general, those people's opinions were like not entirely positive, or they felt like a little bit cautious or like a little bit wary. And so I thought that was just kind of like a little bit of an interesting dynamic of the difference in awareness between like people who are in and people who are out. I guess there's it can feel like a little like there's an assumption that people who are in the church are going to like be more likely to recognize the name of somebody who's influential in the church, who's newly called to the apostleship. But in this instance, at least, it was the opposite. And I guess it kind of makes ex-Mormons look maybe a little obsessed, like, which maybe is not totally untrue. But I thought that was interesting. It seemed like, yeah, like I said, there was some reservations from the side of people who consider themselves maybe like a little bit fringy in the church. Some people expressed that they were maybe a little disappointed that he fits like our apostle mold so well, as far as being white, obviously male, obviously, white and American and really highly educated, and having like a background in business that he does. So yeah, that's what we know about him.
That's what we know.
Yeah, I definitely matched the pattern that you described as far as active versus non-active or post-Mormon. I recognized the name, probably from General Conference, but I can't remember a talk that was given or anything like that. But I hadn't heard a single bit about his connection with BYU or the Musket Fire Talk or any of that. So I just learned this week. So my claim to fame by association is that my uncle was his mission companion.
Oh,
There you go.
So, and he's 55, and that
yeah,
age 55, which is a definite,
that's young,
significant talking point with a lot of different commentators, and so
yeah, quite young.
Yeah, younger than my parents. So.
Yeah, my parents are old enough to be his parents.
Yeah, right.
I was thinking specifically that like he's like realistically like he could be my brother. You know, there'd be like quite the age gap,
Sure.
but that feels weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's like somebody on Ex-Mormon Reddit, I think, that I don't know if you've seen this chart. It's like he does these statistical analyses of like who is most likely to be prophet in what year, kind of moving forward, taking the current apostleship and like their ages and tenure and so forth. And anyway, it's like all these curves of like probabilities and stuff. And
interesting.
At least according to this guy, like Clark Gilbert will likely be the prophet like one day, you know, based on his age and assuming nothing
compared to the
crazy
others,
happens with his health or anything. So
Yeah.
So new things to come. I guess we'll probably hear more about him as time moves forward. At least when I was in the church, like the junior apostles, I don't know, I didn't really know too much about them, like even several years into their tenureship. I don't know about you guys, but so
Yeah.
like
Probably.
we'll hear conference talks and we'll just get to know.
Are you
better.
saying leading up to them being called, or
even after?
when the younger ones after they're called?
Yeah, even after. I guess there's just something about like the time you've been in the apostles, like, you know,
being recognizable,
being like you've got so many talks behind you.
Mm-hmm.
You have
Every
patterns.
6 months,
Yeah,
patterns.
Things
themes
right.
that
You like to talk about airplanes or
Exactly.
sorry, I'm so popular. Unbelievable. Yeah. Whatever you're
So
begin to be known for.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess one thing that you met Benjamin Park
At the mall.
At the mall.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Professor Park?
Through Sunstone.
Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Not super in depth about his content.
Sure. He wrote a really good book called American Zion that I listened to this last year. And I really didn't know too much about like Mormon history after we came to Utah. And so this was like a great book for me, at least, to like learn, you know, what happened between 1870 and 2000, basically, and kind of stuff that was going on. And so there's been these waves of kind of like progressivism versus like conservatism within the church itself and within like BYU that kind of comes in these waves, like going back and forth. And so we're kind of in this another wave of potentially having a little bit more kind of strictness, so to speak. But I mean, it's also Professor Park also like pointed out that some of the most hardline people in the past have also changed their stances like drastically after coming into leadership. So I don't want to judge him too quickly. But I guess we'll see what happens.
We'll see.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the news, but kind of off that topic and in general, we wanted to talk about like priesthood a little bit today and like authority. So
Yeah, I think, I feel comfortable saying that Clark Gilbert isn't a perfect person, right? I think we can say that about everybody. And like I mentioned, there are people who are thrilled to have him. There are people who are a lot less thrilled. There's one creator on Instagram called LDS Changemakers. I'm sure you follow.
I believe I follow them, but they don't show up in my feed very often.
Okay. And then you live under a rock, right? So
You live under a rock.
So you don't.
Big rock.
But yeah, LDS Changemakers, it's basically run by this woman who tries to advocate for change within the church, within the current policies of the church.
Okay.
And I saw her express a little bit of reservation about, or a little bit of concern about his appointment. But then also I noticed on the church's Instagram post about him being newly called that she was like, congratulations, like, welcome to have you, like, we're happy to have you, and just was being really, really supportive. Mm-hmm. And somebody commented underneath and said, wait a second, like, aren't you just like complaining about him like on your stories? And she like showed up and I think defended herself appropriately for having two different feelings coexisting at the same time. And it just kind of got me thinking about like how we cope with authority in priesthood leaders when we know that those priesthood leaders aren't perfect, right? Imperfect people called to represent a perfect savior and what I think some people would feel like is a perfect church. Mm-hmm. And so this happens at every level of leadership. It happens at the general level, at the level of the apostleship. And there is grappling that members need to do in that way. But I think most members do a lot more grappling when it comes down to like what's happening at the local level. I think that principle is the same, like an imperfect person called to represent a perfect thing. But it sort of plays out differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of go back to just this idea of the bigger picture as far as you described kind of maybe the progressive and then maybe some retrenchment, or I can't remember the term that you used, but back into more conservative traditions and ideals. I was just thinking about this last night as we were kind of preparing for some of these topic discussions today, that progression looks like, I would say over human history, we can acknowledge that there's been progression with a lot of things. But sometimes we progress moving upwards as time moves forward, and then we might digress and then work up even further than our previous progression, and then we fall and then we rise even further, right? That's kind of how I've experienced my own patterns of progression as an individual, but I think it applies with humanity as well. So in that, like, I was thinking back to like the 5 books of Moses, right? I am very glad I do not live in the time of the 5 books of Moses, with just some of the traditions and some of their laws that were definitely unequal and became oppressive to different classes of people. And I think, we're going to look back, not we, but humanity might look back at this time in 1,000 years and think, I'm very glad I'm not living 1,000 years ago.
I just had the thought, like, they had laws that were oppressive to certain classes of people. Great, like,
Crazy.
Can't imagine.
Yeah, and that maybe that resonates with us here while we're in the middle of the present, right? And then in the future, looking back towards the present as the past, then we might have similar thoughts and feelings about it. And so I think that is just part of the progression of humanity and life in general, that while we're in the middle of it, it's like, man, this is so, it is oppressive. But for me, it's like, okay, what can I be a part of as far as hopes to balance those things out? Because again, I feel like we're in such a better place today versus where we were 200 years ago or where we were 2,000 years ago in a lot of ways.
I
So I just kind of wanted to bring that back. At least for me, that was on my mind last night, and getting the larger picture of it, so that when we talk about the details of the present, that I can still maintain some hope instead of getting overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys can relate to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, right?
Yep.
And I don't know. I guess I've been watching Avatar: The Last Airbender recently, if you guys have seen that.
For sure.
And it's all about balance and all this stuff, and it just kind of sparked in my mind, like, what if sometimes that 2 steps forward, 1 step back is like part of the natural cycle of things, and like in a way balances out maybe too broad of a swing that could cause like disharmony, or anyway, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, it does.
Definitely.
but yeah, like I agree.
And tying that in with Clark Gilbert being definitely on the more conservative end, and laying down the law realm, just considering with Avatar, like the different, the air, the water, the fire, and the earth. For me, I feel like diversity has become a very significant value of mine. And because sometimes if we only have airbenders, I mean, it's going to just be kind of chaotic, right?
Sure.
If we only have firebenders, it's going to be really passionate all the time, and maybe a lot of hurts given and whatnot. Anyway, we don't need to go into the details of those metaphors, but again, this diversity and a balance between different types of personalities, I think that's a good thing overall, because like we've talked about the pendulum swings, maybe it swings towards progressivism, and then maybe it swings back to the conservatism. And if it swings too far in either direction, it's hurtful for the other perspective. If there were only 2 perspectives, it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously. But having that diverse group of people is a good thing, in my opinion. But who decides that? Like, what if something is imbalanced? How do we correct that balance? So yeah,
That was good.
with Clark Gilbert, I feel like there are currently maybe more progressive-minded general authorities in the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency than ever before in my lifetime. And I'm kind of new to some of these thoughts and things, but that's kind of my sense. And maybe someone felt like God, right? As far
Sure.
as the tradition and the theology goes, God felt like maybe we need a little bit more conservative voice and whatnot, so we don't swing too far in the progressive, and that the conservatives don't feel like they can be part of the whole of the church. And yeah.
No, it's good points that have been brought up. I guess kind of tying this into not just like the apostleship, but like as Juliet was saying, like the lower levels and stuff too. Like, I think often for me, like being more critical of the church at times, I kind of feel like I kind of get into this mindset at times of like, oh, these people are evil or like not good or whatever, like kind of throw out a pejorative term in that way. And it's just so much more complex and 2 sides of a coin, right? Like, I've had great bishops and I've had not so great bishops. I've had not so great bishops do great things and great bishops do some not so great things, and other leaders as well. So, kind of something that we were talking about, like in our own little group chat, was just like, it's often we maybe from both perspectives of like a believer and a non-believer maybe forget the humanity a little bit. I think, was it you who brought that up in that chat? I can't remember.
I don't know.
Somebody brought it up.
Someone really
Someone
smart.
kinda did
Really
it all.
smart.
But it was, I don't know, just a good reminder that like these people are human. Let's not make them a saint, and let's not make them like the worst of the worst either. Like they're somewhere in the middle, as we all are. And yeah, just remember that kind of moving forward, I guess. So
Can I read something?
yeah.
From an Instagram friend. I asked the people just like their thoughts on how we cope with imperfect people representing a perfect savior and what we can do about that as individuals and as a community. And this person said, "This is so hard because I feel like some bishops rule by the letter of the law, while other bishops rule by the spirit of the law, which I personally think is better. I do believe that bishops are called of God. I've experienced the best, in capital letters, bishop over the last few years. But I think that some bishops are called to help certain people during their time, and they are not for every single member in the ward. I don't think they could be. That would be so difficult. But if they truly allow themselves to be humbled and used by God, they can be such a good one. Others go on a power trip and think that they've, quote unquote, made it." I feel like that kind of like sort of summed up what you said. And I think, so there's like this idea of being like letter of the law versus spirit of the law. And I think that often like the spirit of the law like feels better, you know, like we think of the letter of the law as being like too orthodox, too strict, like, you know, disconnected from the human experience. But I think the issue with the spirit of the law is that if there's no letter, if there's no like written down rule, then there can be a lot of variation in how that spirit of the law gets applied to people. And I think particularly if you begin to have people comparing experiences with one another, and a bishop or a stake president or whomever has dealt with one person differently than another, I guess from the bishop's or the leader's perspective, it could be, well, I was going by the Spirit. I was, you know, God told me to do a different thing in these two different situations. But to the person who feels like they've been dealt with more harshly, then it's hard for them not to feel like they're just being picked on or singled out, you know? And so I think that that's one of the tensions of that kind of a role.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that comment is a really fair comment, and I think the general membership of the mainstream church can acknowledge that local leaders can make mistakes, and treat people poorly and whatnot. But at what level does that stop, right? You know, is it only local leadership? Is it the ward or branches? Is it the stake? Is it the area? Is it the General 70? Is it the apostleship? Or is it even the president? And I think oftentimes we, kind of like you were saying, Mitch, the term that I kind of think of is we deify the president or demonize the president, depending on maybe our perspective, if we agree with different political or religious statements and policies and whatnot. But I think oftentimes, yeah, just going back to what you said, we don't allow for that humanity at any level. But I think, at least my experience, I think a big reason for me that I'm and maybe used to isn't accurate even still, because I'm still working on it, but that I especially used to either deify or demonize other people. I think part of the reason for that is because that's kind of how the doctrine sets us up to think, about the institution and the hierarchy and the people who fill the positions within the line of authority and who we answer to, is that, the bishops haven't proven themselves yet, really. This is their test. And then they go up through the ranks until they've proven themselves. And how could someone who hasn't been proven as reliable and following God, how could they be called by God? And again, kind of going back to our previous discussion, that is somewhat of a simplistic approach to it. I think the stories in the scriptures clearly indicate that that's not a guarantee, that those mistakes won't be made at any level. Yeah.
Do you feel like you were done enough, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think this is where it gets like so uncomfy. Is that I think that the three of us and everyone listening, watching, is pretty happy to grant everyone their humanity, right? Like, for example, politicians, really powerful people. Even the ones that we really like, that we consider like on our sides, I think that we are happy to admit, they're not perfect. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to make big mistakes. They're going to make mistakes that affect people, and especially that are affecting vulnerable people, right? But they can be called out. We can change laws. Things can be overturned. They can go on 60 Minutes and have their feet held to the fire. I think in the church, what we run up against is, okay, like, I accept that my bishop is a human being, my stake president, all the way up, that they're going to make mistakes. But when those people who make mistakes have authority and power over us in pretty big ways, and there's not a legitimized way within the system to,
like, checks and balances on
like, what do we do about that? If it's okay if I share a little story, there was a time several years ago where I had a bishop that told me that I couldn't have my temple recommend until I, get this, stopped being depressed. Which, first of all, I've been depressed since I was literally 9 years old. Like, if I could have figured that out, believe me, I would have. But also, I was quite Orthodox. My connection to the church and my sense of worthiness in the church was really, really important to me. I really like the temple.
You said last time that we talked, you were really proud of having that piece of paper.
Yeah, it was really important to me. And so for me, it kind of felt like a catch-22. I'm not sure if I'm using that phrase correctly, but it's like, well, I can't feel good and be happy if I don't have my temple recommend. I need that.
Yeah.
And I, he told me that. I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I tried to not be depressed. We met again a few weeks later, and was I still depressed? Yes. But I thought that I had proven that I had tried enough to be able to get it back. And he felt differently. He felt like I wasn't doing a good enough job of that. And I, tried to, with my level of ADHD and anxiety, I need things to be concrete or else I feel so overwhelmed. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, what do I, tell me what I need to do? What are the boxes I can check off, right? Give me a sense of security that this is the goal. I do these things and then we're good. Then I can have it back. And he was like, well, I think we should just wait and see. And I was like, what? I don't know what we're waiting. I don't know how to be good.
Right.
I don't.
What will change a month from now?
Yeah. I was like, I don't know how to be good. And I feel like I have no power here. I feel like you have all of the power. He did have all of the power. And I remember, so this is live in Utah, and I had gone home to California to visit, and I was just feeling so overwhelmed, and I was able to I realized I feel like I have no power, and I feel like he is stringing me along. And I just I called him and I told him that. I said, I feel like you have all of the power. I don't have any. I don't know what to do. And this doesn't feel fair. Which that felt kind of radical to just call up your bishop and be like, hey, I feel like the way that you're managing this isn't right, and it doesn't feel fair to me. And you know what he said?
What?
He said, I think you're right. And he said, how about as soon as you get back into town, come and see me and we'll get this taken care of. And that's what we did. And I am really grateful for that response from him. I was surprised by it. I'm really proud of him that he was just able to say yeah, guess what? Yeah, you know what? I've been doing this the wrong way, and I am willing to admit it to the person that I have been mistreating and turn around and make it right. And I think that he deserves a lot of credit for that. I think overall he was a good bishop and a very caring man. And I think that we all have stories of priesthood leaders being incredible, being so supportive of us, being really important figures in our lives, going above and beyond. And so I think that that's an example of him doing the right thing. But I also think that he shouldn't have had that power in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, he was a general contractor. What did he know about my mental health? Literally nothing. He just wasn't, in my opinion, he was so unqualified to be making the kinds of assessments that he was making. And do I understand it? Yes. I understand that he was in a position managing a lot of people, a lot of people's experiences, a lot of people's spiritualities, and that he was 100% volunteering, doing the best that he could. And his mistake was understandable. I don't hold any of that against him, but it gave him an amount of power that had real effects on me that I think were wrong. And that comes from the system.
I agree. And you calling him up and kind of calling him out on that, that's... I've never heard of that happening before. I guess I'll just say that.
I had to go rogue.
Yeah.
I had to go outside the system.
That's not allowable.
The
I had to go outside the system.
Yeah, the system doesn't allow for that. And often, the bishop does. It's taught that your leader receives revelation for you in a way, right, over whatever area they have the keys, or I forget the semantics of it. But so first off, good for you for calling him out.
Thanks. It was scary.
And going against the system a little bit like that. And yeah, kind of like we were saying earlier, that there isn't a system of checks and balances with this. And if you were to just kind of go with what the handbook says, how long would you've been without your temple recommend, I don't know. Could have been his whole tenure as the bishop,
Yeah.
So.
And I don't think the handbook says anything about depression being a cause for unworthiness.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, it
That's
was. Yeah. It was.
I think that's an older
little
thought.
wild.
I don't know. I'm thinking more of the boomer generation and older kind of saw depression as more of a thing from Satan kind of thing.
Yeah, like a flaw.
Yeah, something like that. So I'm glad we're changing in that aspect, right? But also recognizing that, that did happen, and the system allowed for it to happen, and maybe in a way kind of created that,
Yeah.
So.
And I was it sent me into the depths.
Yeah.
And I mean, like real harm was happening to me, and much worse harm has come to other people because of like that dynamic that is there. And yeah, it's not benign.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, makes me wish that we did have more of a system of checks and balances on the power within the church.
I had one person commented when I asked about this. They just said one word. They said the word training in all caps with like 5 eyes, and I said, why don't you tell me more? And they didn't respond, but it's okay. I know this person and I know what they meant. They meant this whole thing with these issues with the bishops would be improved if they had more training in things. Like I think mental health, abuse, like interpersonal relationships. And I think even just training, like a little bit more guidance maybe on like what their scope is supposed to be in their role, like when they should be referring out.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is an example of something that can still fall squarely within the system and would solve a lot of problems. Like I don't think that would be particularly radical. I don't think we need to disrupt anything. But I think that's a way that this could be addressed, that we could improve.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I guess in some ways in our context here, I also feel a responsibility to like represent maybe what the active members would be thinking at this point, right? And my thoughts are with section 121, when it talks about the rights of the priesthood are inseparably connected with the powers of heaven. It talks about how it's the nature and disposition of almost all men. Once they get a little authority, they begin exercising unrighteous dominion, right? Mm-hmm. And I think training, when it's deliberate, I mean, even that alone is helpful. That's kind of a calling out of sorts as far as what we naturally do. It's like, it's the worst of our humanity that when we have a little authority over someone, like a bishop, having control over whether you can have your temple recommend or not, that authority that is possessed and conferred and like all of the tangible things saying that they are set apart, they're not just a fellow anymore, right? That control can so quickly be exercised poorly, and that shows like that worst part of humanity of trying to control others when we feel like we have that control over them. But the training, I think, can help curb that and can be kind of a check on that, because I don't think people naturally want to control other people consciously. It's more of a subconscious motivation that if it's pointed out, then like, I think it was, I think Mr. Rogers says, if it's mentionable, it's manageable, or something like that. And I really like that a lot, because if we can identify something, then we can start to address it if it's out of order, if it's imbalanced or it needs to be checked. And I think that training can be not just a good thing, but an essential thing, so that this power differentiation between someone who represents God's will in our personal lives, just so that doesn't get out of control and damage a person individually. Because that's a big thing, like that. This person is telling me what God's will is for me. Well, if I don't agree with it, or if I don't follow it, then I'm rejecting God. Like that's a heavy thing. Mm-hmm. That's a heavy responsibility if that's how we interpret the responsibility of a leader for the member. And that's a heavy responsibility for the member when that perspective is that God is speaking personally to me, when it might just be someone who's trying to do their best, trying to help you, feeling like, man, if Juliet was just happy, her life would be good, you know? And it's like, maybe that's a little bit short-sighted or uninformed or too simplistic for maybe the circumstances that are going on in the details of someone's life instead of just the outward appearance to the bishop, you know?
Yeah. Something that's coming to my mind with like the training is just maybe how different Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is when it comes to local leadership than like most other Christian churches, in that we have, you know, somebody in the neighborhood all of a sudden gets a call from somebody else in the neighboring neighborhood, the stake president, that they are supposed to like lead over this congregation for 5 years kind of thing. And every 5 years that cycle repeats. And so I just wonder like how much different these kind of things would be if we had more of like a official clergy in a way that was professionally trained on, like, you know, people went to 2 to 4 years of school on how to be a bishop, and that was what they did for 20 years, you know, 10 years, something like a more longer time span. I don't know. Does that?
Yeah, I understand.
Like that's heavy duty training.
Yeah.
And maybe a little bit unrealistic and probably not going to change anytime soon, but like maybe what are some ways that training of a leader are currently taking place? Because I'm not really aware. I'm just like,
I mean,
I don't know.
all I hear is that there's just not enough, I guess, as far as like, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I guess that I feel like the way it's set up of like anybody, well, again, any man, obviously, can be called to be a bishop or a stake president or whatever. Like, something about that feels so good to me because it feels like it's God choosing. You know, it wasn't that someone who liked the sound of their own voice went to, you know, got a degree in theology and now they make a profit off of hearing the sound of their own voice, right? Which is obviously like a gross, probably mischaracterization of like people who choose ministry. Sure. Like it feels like, oh God, like this is real, like God just sees the soul of this man, you know, just sees that this person is good, sees that he, you know, loves his neighbors and would do a good job of this and is choosing him. Like that's sort of how it feels to me, that it's also like your leaders and or God, like whatever the mechanism is just choosing you. Like you don't choose it for yourself. And I feel like it contributes to the sense of community that there is in the church, that we're all sort of called to be ready for those positions. You know, we're all kind of called to be ready to minister to our fellow man, you know, in sort of like a big way. And I think that I hear what you're saying. And I think it's a lot of the root of like why we have these issues, maybe compared to other religions. It just feels like such a big part of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are pros and cons to the official formal training and pros and cons to the lack of training, right? Because we were kind of joking about on Marco Polo or our text thread that Jesus called the fishermen. He didn't call the doctors and the lawyers, right, to be his apostles and his leaders over the flock. So there is comfort there that it does come directly from God, and they don't have to have the worldly qualifications for that, right? I don't know. It's a good question. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Maybe some level of formal training, but in a way that allows that you don't have to, what's the word? Just that possibility is available to every man, is available to every man, not dependent on their level of education. That it's, yeah. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say or the terms that I've heard before
Sure.
in other places to describe what I'm trying to say now. But yeah, just that the positions are available to more people. You don't have to. I'm thinking like with politics that you have to have money to enter politics, or you have to have education to enter a church leadership position. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I wish I could put it more succinctly, but that it's available to everybody, but that there's also deliberate training, especially for things where feedback and issues have come up. Like for me, what kind of opened my eyes to see things in maybe not quite the same simplistic view that I used to have was hearing about some of the abuses happening by leaders. And that oftentimes, just to maintain the good name of the church, that some of those things were just kept in-house and kept really quiet. And the problem with that is, for one, it doesn't really acknowledge for the victims that those things have happened. And for two, for the perpetrators, it kind of sends a message of, not that this is encouraged, but it's, and not even allowable, but that it's
Like tolerated to a degree.
tolerated to a degree.
Yeah.
But the training of just watching out for each other and not being in those situations where abuses could happen, I think there have been steps made, but I think there are leaps that still need to be made so that those things don't happen. Because when abuse happens outside of this power differentiation of control and power from the authority, then people feel like they can speak up. Generally, I would say, they can tell their parents. But if it happens within the context of this leader called by God mantle, then when those abuses happen, if they tell their parents, it's like there's automatically a skepticism. There's automatically a denial, like an incredulity that could even happen. It's out of the realm of possibility. Otherwise, how could God call that person?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I know we're bringing up a lot of complex things, and maybe this is maybe meant for a different podcast episode, but
Sure.
The bottom line for me is that power differential leads people to act differently than they would if the same things happened outside of that structure.
Yeah. I think you're mentioning, I think that there's like sometimes there are leaders who are committing the abuse, right? Which is awful. What I think is more common is that people are just being abused and leaders become involved and then handle it in whatever way that maybe is not totally appropriate or totally helpful, or maybe sometimes ways that is not totally legal. And once the religious leader who has authority has been involved, if they have, either acted or not acted, it sort of like puts a pin on it, a pin in it. Mm-hmm. And then even though they're not the ones who are doing the abuse, which the vast majority of the time, I don't think they're the ones doing the abuse. But it's like, if they've dealt with it in a way that doesn't feel right to the people involved, it's very difficult for those people to have, again, like any sort of recourse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's just something that comes with being called by God, right?
Something.
And I don't know. I think kind of like we were saying, there's leaps that need to be made in the training, but there have been steps that have been taken in the past. And I don't know, week-long course or something, like just kind of getting into these things would be so helpful. But I think probably one of the biggest things is just like we're doing right now, just talking about kind of this stuff. Because I think for the longest time, it's just, well, they were called by God, like, and leave it at that.
Yeah.
How, again, kind of like that automatic, like if you hear something that a leader maybe did wrong, instant knee-jerk reaction is like, that couldn't happen. So just being able to recognize the flaws in the system, recognize the good parts of the system as well, and, you know, if and when somebody listening becomes a leader, like at the very least they just have a little bit more knowledge of kind of like what has happened in the past and so forth. So there's, you know, we're not experts in this. We're just a few former members and a current member, but
we're experts in our own lives.
Yeah,
though.
that's right.
Like we're experts of our own experiences and opinions.
yeah.
And that's what we're sharing. We're not professionals, like
Yeah.
you say. We're not.
Yeah.
We're not sharing professional opinions
Yeah.
about these things.
Should have
for
started
sure.
with that maybe.
If it wasn't obvious to everybody.
Yeah.
We're not experts. Mitch, do you want to, we are like, to kind of send us out, like, you wrote on our little paper Mitch's experience with bishops as a youth, if we have time. And I really, if there's anything that you want to share about that, then I would love for us, we can make the time for it if you want to.
I'll make it quick, basically. I guess in my growing up as an adolescent, I had two bishops during that time, middle school until first part of college kind of thing. And just the feeling of like how differently they worked with me on like a one-on-one level was just very, I wouldn't say night and day, but twilight and dusk.
Okay. which are the same thing, twilight and dusk.
Okay. So
okay.
not
Twilight.
Got
and
it.
dusk, night.
Sorry.
Twilight and night.
I guess what I'll say is just like I had one that the systems that he used with me in like personal things that I was going through maybe didn't help and in some ways made things worse. And the other bishop, in the way that he dealt with kind of things, just really helped me like progress in a lot of different ways. So I know that's really vague and whatever, but just kind of out of interest of time, maybe we can talk about it another day. But I guess it's, and not just with like bishops either, but like, you know, young men's leaders, on my mission as well, like different leaders I had there, like having this diversity basically has really opened up my eyes to how differently people can lead and how that affects like those who are being led or to whom they are stewards over. So a good question maybe we could all ask ourselves when we're in any position of leadership, inside or outside of the church, is something I say to my daughter a lot, like, are you hurting or are you helping? And just that inward reflection of like, and getting the feedback of like those you're with is one way that those checks can be implemented, I guess. But in the current system, it does kind of take the leader being forward about that, or in your case, I guess,
the
stepping up a little
the
bit.
wildling.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but that's kind of what we have to work with for now. So anyway, I hope this conversation has been helpful for people.
Yeah.
But any last thoughts?
I don't think so.
I've got one. I think the biggest message that I would want to get across, as far as my experience and my opinion goes, is we have practical leadership authority, like positions and responsibilities in the church, but ultimately we as individuals are the authorities to act in our lives. If we look at it in terms of it's between God and me, Like that is the highest. And then I also interact with like within the organization with other leaders. Yeah, I think that's fair. But when it comes to our personal lives, I think one of the biggest messages that Jesus taught as well as lived by is that there's nobody that stands between us and God, no matter what earthly or spiritual authority that they may have. All people have equal access to God, no matter the position, no matter the sex of a person. We don't have to rely on other people who are flawed themselves to have that connection with God. I know I repeated myself a bunch, but hopefully at one of those iterations landed in a way that the message came across.
No,
100%.
I feel like it did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone said on Instagram in response to this topic, don't let yourself be micromanaged by a bishop with 4 exclamation points. And I think that sort of sums it up. And it can be tricky. Like, how do you actually do that? But I think that is just that, like, asserting your relationship to God is number one.
Yeah.
And that you have a relationship with him or them directly.
And to just tag on to that comment, I'd say bishops, don't allow yourselves to have people ask you to micromanage their lives either.
Ooh.
Because I think there's a natural tendency that we kind of want to outsource our authority to someone else.
Preach.
Yeah, no, that's
And that's a hard position for the bishop to be in as well. And so safeguarding against that. And then feeling like, man, this person's so dependent on me. Well, everyone's dependent on me because I have that same relationship of authority with them. And then it can move into this is the right thing because this is what they need. It's like, I feel like people need, again, like I'd said earlier, that personal empowerment to be the authority in our own lives and not to enable this, call it codependent relationship between a bishop and a member. And it'll be a whole lot easier on the bishop and it'll be a whole lot easier on the member when that independence for both of them, for each of them are practiced and exercised. Because the micromanaging, it gets exhausting. It gets, we spin in our minds because it's like, well, am I doing exactly what the bishop said? I should check with him. And it's like, that takes time. How about, am I doing what I feel is the right thing?
Yeah.
And that can be an immediate conversation that we have with ourselves as individuals instead of waiting a week or 2 weeks. Am I worthy? Am I worthy? You know, and again, this is speaking from my experience where I'd spiral. And anyway, I'd ask for that micromanaging of my life. Like, am I okay? Am I okay
100%.
by doing this?
Yeah.
And almost asking permission instead of exercising my intuition and again, that inner authority. Anyway.
No, it's great. Well, thanks, guys. This has been a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for checking in with us each week. I think we talked about, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but kind of moving forward, we're going to be having 3 of these types of episodes like per month. And then we also were thinking about doing like a live so that our audience members can interact with us on more of a live kind of basis. So follow us on Instagram. That's where we'll be posting our kind of announcements and when you can tune into that. If you guys are still interested in kind of doing that kind of thing.
That's why
I need to tune into Instagram. Get out from under this rock that I put myself under.
That's good. Okay. Well, thanks, guys. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.